It is the 19th of August, 1942, and a hole has just been cut through a wire fence at Stalag XXA, a prisoner of war camp outside the Polish town of Thorn. Two men in ill-fitting civilian suits slip through the gap and walk, quite calmly, towards a railway station. One of them, a lance corporal with a first-class degree in modern languages from Oxford, is carrying forged papers that describe him as a traveling salesman for Siemens. The other, a bricklayer's son from Nottinghamshire who left school at 14, has spent 18 months learning enough German to pass, at a glance, as his colleague. Behind them lies 2 years of prison camp routine, hunger, and the particular boredom of captivity. Ahead of them lies 250 miles of occupied Germany, a continent at war, and a border they must reach before anyone asks the wrong question. Neither man has any real reason to trust the other's survival to his own. They do so anyway. This is the story of Anthony Coulthard and Fred Foster, and of a decision made on the shore of a lake that would cost one man his freedom for 3 more years, and the other man his life. It is not a story about a weapon or a machine. It is a story about what a man is prepared to give up for a friend, and it deserves to be told with the same care historians usually reserve for the hardware of war, because in its own way, it says more about the character of that conflict than any tank or aircraft ever could. For much of the last 80 years, almost nobody outside one Nottinghamshire family knew this story existed at all. No war memorial carries both names side by side. No museum case holds the forged papers or the tailored suits the two men wore out of the camp. What survives is a grave, a suitcase of documents discovered decades later, and the patient work of one man determined to find out what his own father had never been able to say out loud. That in itself tells you something about how unevenly this war has been remembered, and why a tunnel dug by 80 men at Stalag XXA became a household name in Britain, while a friendship tested on the shore of a Swiss lake very nearly disappeared from history altogether. By the middle of 1942, escape had become something close to an obsession within German prisoner of war camps, and for good reason. Roughly 170,000 British and Commonwealth servicemen were held in Germany during the Second World War, and the overwhelming majority of them would spend the entire conflict behind wire, watching the years pass in a haze of forced labor, thin soup, and censored letters from home. Fewer than 1,200 of them ever managed what the prisoners called a home run, a successful escape all the way back to Allied territory. The odds, in other words, were close to 150 to 1 against, and those odds did not account for the additional risk of being shot attempting it. Stalag XXA, near the town of Thorn in what had been northern Poland, was not one of the notorious escape-proof fortresses like Colditz. It was, in some ways, worse for morale precisely because it was ordinary. A sprawling network of old forts and outlying subcamps holding thousands of men on forced labor details, with none of the grim celebrity that made other camps famous, and none of the singular focus on security that made escape from Colditz such a documented obsession on both sides of the wire. Men here were marched out daily to work parties, farms, quarries, and rail yards, which meant more contact with the outside world than a purely static camp allowed. But it also meant exhaustion, poor food, and years stretching ahead with no obvious end. Coulthard, captured in France in 1940 while serving with the Intelligence Corps, and Foster, taken during the Norwegian campaign the same year, met inside its wire and became friends despite having almost nothing in common. Coulthard was the privately educated son of a comfortable family, fluent in German and several other languages, and had graduated from Oxford with first-class honors. Foster had left school at 14 without a single qualification, the son of a bricklayer from Nottinghamshire. Fellow prisoners, apparently amused by the contrast, nicknamed Coulthard the Professor. What the two men shared was a determination to get home, and a recognition that the usual methods of escape, tunnels, wire cutting, disguises as farm laborers or workmen on the outside details, had been tried by hundreds of men before them and had failed almost every time. A tunnel could be betrayed by a single informer or discovered by a single probing rod pushed into soft ground. A laborer's disguise collapsed the moment a genuine German farmhand asked a question its wearer could not answer. Coulthard and Foster wanted a method that did not depend on avoiding contact with the enemy, because in a country crawling with soldiers on leave and police checking papers at every station, avoiding contact indefinitely was simply not realistic. The problem the two men faced was not simply getting outside the wire. Dozens of prisoners managed that much each year. The problem was surviving afterwards, inside a police state where identity papers were checked constantly, where every railway platform carried soldiers on leave, and where a single mispronounced word could end an escape within minutes of it beginning. Most escapers who made it past the fence were recaptured within days, hungry, exhausted, and unable to explain themselves to the first patrol that stopped them. Coulthard and Foster concluded that the only way to beat those odds was not to hide from the system, but to walk straight through the middle of it, dressed as ordinary Germans going about ordinary business. The plan the two men built over roughly 2 years inside the camp was, by the standards of any wartime escape, extraordinarily patient. Coulthard, drawing on his fluency in the language, spent 3 hours most evenings quietly coaching Foster in German. Not just vocabulary, but the rhythms of everyday conversation, the slang a real German traveler might use without thinking. Foster, for his part, talked his way into the job of editing the camp's newspaper, which gave him legitimate access to a typewriter fitted with German characters, the tool he needed to forge identity documents that would pass inspection. Letterheaded paper was stolen and repurposed to support the pair's cover story that they were two commercial travelers working for the electronics firm Siemens. 2 civilian suits, tailored well enough to survive close scrutiny, were supplied with the help of the Polish resistance operating quietly around the camp. None of this was glamorous work. It was closer to a slow piece of theatrical production, rehearsed over many months, with every prop and line of dialogue tested against the possibility of a Gestapo officer's raised eyebrow. The two men fixed on a route that ran deliberately through the heart of the Reich rather than around its edges, on the theory that the last place anyone would look for escaped prisoners was inside a crowded train carriage full of German soldiers traveling home on leave. It was a gamble that inverted the usual logic of escape, trading the relative safety of open country for the relative anonymity of a packed compartment, and it depended entirely on nerve-holding under direct, sustained contact with the enemy. When the two men finally went through the fence in August 1942, that nerve was tested almost immediately. On the train out of occupied Poland, they found themselves sharing a carriage with German soldiers and exchanged the obligatory Hitler salute without hesitation, a small but telling detail of how completely they had absorbed their disguise. In Berlin, a suspicious member of the public reported them to a Gestapo officer, and only a combination of composure and Coulthard's flawless German talked their way past what should have been the end of the escape. Day by day, the two men zigzagged south and west across a landscape thick with checkpoints, moving through territory where a single stumble in an accent or a misplaced word on a forged document could have ended everything in a cell. Subscribing to this channel costs nothing and helps far more than you might think, so if a story like this is holding your attention, a quick subscribe is genuinely appreciated. After roughly 250 miles on foot, by rail, and on whatever transport presented itself, the two men reached the shore of Lake Constance, the wide stretch of water separating southern Germany from neutral Switzerland in the fading days of the summer of 1942. Compared with the famous tunnel escapes of Colditz or the mass breakout later immortalized as the Great Escape from Stalag Luft 3, this was not an escape built on engineering ingenuity below ground. It was built on 2 years of linguistic and psychological preparation, and it had brought both men within sight of the border they had spent 2 years working towards. At the checkpoint itself, the plan finally met its limit. Coulthard, whose papers and accent had survived every previous test, was waved through by the border guards and stepped onto neutral soil. Foster was stopped. Something about his documents, perhaps a detail in the German that did not quite ring true even after 18 months of coaching, drew a second look from the guard, and he was held. Coulthard, already free, already within reach of everything the two men had planned for, turned round and walked back across the line to try to talk his friend through. It did not work. Both men were arrested at gunpoint, taken to Gestapo custody, beaten, and held for days before being separated and returned to captivity. What happened next split their two stories in different directions. Foster was sent to another camp, and the two friends would never meet again. He survived the remainder of the war and returned home to Nottinghamshire in 1945, eventually building a successful career as a builder and later serving as mayor of Grantham. Coulthard was returned to Stalag XXA, where, remarkably, he made 8 further escape attempts, all of them unsuccessful. As the Red Army advanced into Poland in the winter of 1945, he was among the tens of thousands of Allied prisoners forced onto the brutal westward marches the Germans conducted rather than let their captives be liberated, a movement of prisoners that is estimated to have killed around 100,000 men from exhaustion, cold, and disease. Weakened by dysentery and by his own habit of sharing what little food he had with other prisoners, Coulthard died on the 24th of March 1945, less than 2 months before the war in Europe ended, after being forced to bathe in the freezing waters of the River Elbe. He was buried beneath an unmarked cross, aged 27. Set against the more celebrated escape stories of the war, the Coulthard and Foster escape occupies an unusual place. The tunnel from Stalag Luft 3 that produced the Great Escape of March 1944 saw 80 men break out in a single night through a passage more than 100 meters long, of whom only 3 reached safety. And 50 of the recaptured were murdered on Hitler's direct order in reprisal, a war crime that has overshadowed almost every other British escape story since and later became the basis of a famous film. Colditz Castle, built specifically to hold repeat escapers from other camps, produced dozens of attempts and a handful of successes. Most famously, the future politician Harry Neve, who became the first British prisoner to make what the men called a home run from that camp after an earlier attempt had failed because his disguise did not stand up to scrutiny. Both of those stories share a common shape: ingenious engineering or costume, followed by a desperate cross-country dash once outside the wire, usually at night, usually avoiding all contact with the enemy wherever possible. Coulthard and Foster inverted that logic entirely. Rather than avoiding Germans, they spent days traveling among them, on trains, in station queues, exchanging the compulsory salute with soldiers heading home on leave. American escape stories from the same period, such as the 400-kilometer trek across the Greenland ice sheet later chronicled in print, or the various mass breakouts that Allied prisoners staged from camps further west as the war turned against Germany, tended to rely on wilderness, distance, and stealth rather than impersonation. German attempts to prevent escapes of every kind relied on searches, informants planted among the prisoners, and increasingly brutal deterrence as the war went on, yet men kept trying regardless, and the quiet British organization known as MY9 worked to support them with forged documents, maps, and compasses smuggled into camps disguised as ordinary parcels. What set the Coulthard and Foster plan apart from nearly every other attempt on record was its total reliance on sustained, disciplined impersonation rather than concealment, a method closer to espionage tradecraft than to the popular image of prisoners slipping through the wire under cover of darkness, and one that depended for its success almost entirely on 18 months of unglamorous, repetitive language coaching rather than on any single moment of daring. For decades after the war, this particular story remained almost entirely unknown, even within Foster's own family. He rarely spoke about his imprisonment, in keeping with a generation that tended to regard such experiences as private rather than something to be discussed at the dinner table. And it was only after his death in 1989 that his son, Steve Foster, discovered a suitcase of wartime papers and began piecing together what had happened. What he found amounted to fragments rather than a finished account. Identity documents, correspondence, references to a friend named Anthony whom his father had never once mentioned by name in Steve's hearing. Years of patient research followed, including extensive work at the National Archives, cross-checking regimental records, camp registers, and the scattered paperwork of the International Red Cross, before Steve Foster was finally able to trace the exact location of Anthony Coulthard's grave in Germany and see it properly marked and rededicated in a formal ceremony, giving a name back to a man who had spent nearly 70 years beneath an unmarked cross. That research became the basis of the book The Soldier Who Came Back, published in 2018 and co-written with Alan Clark, which finally set out in full what the two men had achieved together and what it had ultimately cost one of them. It is worth being honest about the limits of the record here. Much of what is known comes from Foster's own recollections, reconstructed decades after the events themselves, supplemented by official documents that record outcomes rather than motives. Precisely what passed between the two men in the seconds before Coulthard turned back towards the checkpoint is not and can never be recorded with certainty. What is documented beyond dispute is the outcome: one man free, one man detained, and a decision to turn round rather than walk on. The material legacy of this story is modest by the standards of documentary history. There is no aircraft in a museum, no weapon in a glass case, no factory that can be visited today. What survives is a grave in Germany, now properly named, a suitcase of documents, and a book built from them. The psychological weight of the story, though, has proved considerable precisely because it resists easy categorization as either triumph or tragedy. Foster's escape succeeded in the narrow sense that he lived to see the end of the war and built a full life afterwards. Coulthard's escape also succeeded, in the sense that he crossed the border into Switzerland and was, for a matter of minutes, a free man. And yet neither of those individual successes is really the point of the story, because the moment that defines it is the one where Coulthard turned his back on his own freedom and walked into German custody a second time. That is, in the end, why this story earns its place alongside the tunnels and the disguises and the tanks and the aircraft that usually fill accounts of the Second World War. A tunnel is measured in meters dug and men who got through it. A tank is measured in armor thickness and muzzle velocity. This story is measured differently. It is measured in the distance one man was prepared to walk backwards, away from safety, because a friend had been stopped a few feet behind him. Return for a moment to that railway station outside Thorn in August 1942, to two men in borrowed suits walking calmly towards a train, trusting a plan built on 18 months of whispered grammar lessons and stolen letter-headed paper. Everything that followed, the salutes exchanged with soldiers on leave, the suspicious grandmother in Berlin, the 250 miles of zigzagging across occupied territory was rehearsal for a single moment neither man could have planned for. A border guard glancing twice at one set of papers rather than the other. No amount of preparation could account for that. What could not be planned for was answered, in the end, not by cleverness, but by character. 250 miles of occupied territory, 18 months of nightly language lessons, 2 years of careful planning, all of it brought down to a single decision made in perhaps 10 seconds at a checkpoint on the edge of a lake. Anthony Coulthard had already won his freedom. He gave it back. Fred Foster carried that debt home with him and, for most of his life, never spoke of it at all. It took his son's patient search through a suitcase of old papers to make sure the world would eventually know what his father's friend had done, and to make certain that the unmarked grave of a 27-year-old Oxford graduate finally carried his name. He did not die famous. He died beside a river, weakened by dysentery and by his own habit of giving away his food. Less than 2 months before the war, he had spent 5 years trying to escape finally ended. But he died having already given away the one thing every prisoner in every camp in Europe was fighting to win back. That, more than any tunnel or any disguise, is the measure of what this war asked of ordinary men, and of what some of them, when the moment came, were willing to give.